Welcome to this philosophy course on the philosophical and theological thought of Thomas Aquinas, with special focus on metaphysics, taught at Marquette University and the Catholic University of Leuven in fall of 2013. I'm Richard Taylor, and together with Professor Andrea Robilio, we're presenting this course to students at both institutions. This is video 2A with focus on the sources of Aquinas' natural epistemology. I should note, however, that there will be no video 2B. In place of 2B, I've decided to use two of the video lectures from our course last fall, 2012. And so those are linked for you on the course website with the detailed syllabus. So let's proceed then. Here I'm going to first start out with a discussion of the Platonic and Aristotelian background, and then I'm going to move on to the classical rationalist philosophical tradition in the Islamic lands, and then finally talk a little bit about translations and then proceed. The next two videos that are available to you will be on Aquinas' natural epistemology and the role of the thought of his teacher, Albert the Great, in the formation of Aquinas' thought on this. But let's go back to the Platonic and Aristotelian account. Now, certainly we know Plato was a quite complex thinker, and so we can't cover everything in Plato, but if we take a few moments to think about Republic 6 in Plato's important work, and the notion of the divided line in the cave, I think this will help us a great deal in what's coming. You'll recall that the myth of the cave, the story of the cave, is that the philosopher rises up, or is forced to rise up from the groupings of the ordinary masses of people, and eventually to come to see the outside world and all that's in it, and then goes back down into the cave. And you'll recall, with regard to the divided line, that the realities that we see in this physical world are transitory for Plato, and they are not the objects of knowledge. Rather, they are the objects of sensation. And that one must rise up on the divided line to the level of science, past the level of mathematics, to the level of ideas. And that above the ideas is the notion of the good in Plato's discussion of the divided line. What I want to focus on here is Plato's notion then that we cannot find knowledge in the world itself, but rather, as he puts it in the Republic, one must turn about and posit a one over the many. So this is the procedure, where one finds a plurality of individuals of the same sort, a plurality of human beings, or plurality of beds, that sort of thing. Then one turns away from the physical world and posits a one over the many, and this is the form. So in this way, the sensed forms of the world are essentially imitations of the real forms, those real forms existing in the realm of being. The object of knowing, then, is not something of the physical world of becoming and change for Plato. Somehow, the realm of the forms, of the eternal and unchanging forms, that is also, says Plato, caused by something higher, the good. And of course, you're probably well aware of Plato's Parmenides and his self-critique of the theory of forms there, where he criticizes some of the more simple objections that can be made to the theory of forms. So I think you should keep that in mind, that Plato gives no sign of rejecting the theory of forms completely, but rather wants to have a more sophisticated understanding of the nature of the forms there. And there is in that context that he talks about the forms that are in the heavens, so to speak, and the forms that are here, and whether there's any relationship between the two, and poses a difficulty for his own thought there in that dialogue. At any rate, it seems that one way or another, Plato did hold on to a theory of forms, and certainly the Platonic tradition after him held that view, that there is, as objects of knowledge or objects of intellect, properly speaking, there is a higher level of eternal and unchanging forms that are the objects of knowledge. And the things of this world are perhaps a stimulant in some respects for recollection or some other way, such as the turnabout and posit the one over the many approach that he describes, for forming a real conception of science, and science consists of knowledge of the eternal and unchanging forms. Now let's turn to Aristotle, and this is only ever so briefly. Now Aristotle's De Anima, or On the Soul. In that work, he makes very clear his method, and the method is that objects reveal the activities of the soul. And of course, one of the activities of the soul is sensation, another is intellectual understanding or thinking. The object of sense is sensible things, sensible forms of things in the world. And so through the grasp of the forms of things in the sensible world through sensation, then we are able to come to have sensibles within us in some fashion, in the sense at least. And the object of intellects for him is intelligibles, that is, intelligible forms. This much is quite clear in Aristotle. It's also clear that Aristotle makes a strong distinction between sense and intellect. He raises the question early on in the De Anima that the issue that intellect seems to be different, perhaps another distinct kind of soul or life principle. So it may be on the one hand that there's a life principle which is the actuality of body, and then there's something else called intellect, which is part of a human being in some way or another, and yet is distinct. It isn't something that necessarily requires body. These are the hints that Aristotle gives as he raises questions in the De Anima. Now, as for us, as human beings, insofar as we have knowledge, and we change from not knowing to knowing, then potentiality and actuality must be involved. That is, if we can change into becoming knowing when we were previously not knowing, we had some potentiality or possibility for coming to know. And similarly, that coming to know then, when we do know, has been actualized. So the distinction of actuality and potentiality is suitable here. Now, the most important and challenging, perhaps the most challenging of all of Aristotle's chapters in philosophy, is the rather infamous On the Soul, De Anima 3.5, Book 3, Chapter 5. And here I want to go through that in some detail. Now, I could probably provide 5 to 15 very different interpretations of the De Anima 3.5, and I'm going to try just to read the text for itself. We can talk later about how it was read in the tradition, but for now I just want to remind you of what's in that chapter, and we'll do this by reading the text through 3 slides. So, I'll offer a few comments as we go. So let's proceed with the text. Since in every class of things, as in nature as a whole, we find 2 factors involved, a matter which is potentially all the particulars included in the class, and a cause which is productive in the sense that it makes them all, the latter standing to the former as an art to its material, these distinct elements must likewise be found within the soul. So this is his way of expressing what I expressed in the previous slide, that is, that if knowledge comes to be in us, then there must be a potential aspect to it, and there must be something that actualizes that. In the case of sensation, the actualization comes by the image of the thing outside, the sensible particular, coming to the eye. And what makes that possible in the sense of the eye is light. Light makes it possible for this to happen in some way. But in the case of intellect, it's different. Something different is going on, because we are not seeing sensible things in that way, but rather we're seeing something that in some way is intelligible, not sensible, something that can be in a way universal, whereas the sensibles are all determinate particulars. So there must be these 2 aspects, the aspect of actualizing and the aspect of becoming. And what becomes must be potential. And we come to be knowers after we were not knowers. So we must have that within us, the ability to become knowers, the receptive aspect of knowing, as it were, and then there must be something to actualize that. Of course, in this case, it's not light, physical light in the world, because that's what was used in the case of sensation, used in the description of coming to have sensible understanding or apprehension of something. Let's go on with the next part of De Anima 3.5. He continues, and I might translations from the the edition by Barnes. And in fact, thought, as we have described it, is what it is by virtue of becoming all things. So when we go from not thinking to thinking, then we become, in some way, the things that are thought. He goes on, while there is another, which is what it is by virtue of making all things. This is a sort of positive state like light, for in a sense, light makes potential colors into actual colors. Now let's pause for a moment here. Keep in mind that Aristotle's conception of light is not the same as our conception of light. So his using light as a metaphor here is quite different from the notion of ordinary light. For Aristotle, light actualizes the ability of a medium to be transparent. So in this case then, if he's using this conception to explain what it is to intellectualize something or make something knowable, then the active part here, that is the part that he says is another, which is that by virtue of making all things, okay, if that is like light, then it means it's a necessary condition for the possibility of apprehending intellectually, just as light is a necessary condition for apprehending by way of sensation. So without the actualizing presence of light, there is no vision of anything, because the medium remains opaque for Aristotle. Light makes the medium transparent. Similarly, somehow then, the intellectualizing so-called light then makes potential objects of thought into actual objects of thought. Let's go on then. Thought in this sense of it is separable, impassible, and unmixed, since it is in its essential nature activity, for always the active is superior to the passive factor, the originating force to the matter. Now this is some sort of indication that there is a separable, impassible, and unmixed actualizing part here that makes the actuality of thought possible. Perhaps it is, though, that thought itself is separable, impassible, which of course for Aristotle would have to be, because it's not a physical thing, but rather thought does not take place in the senses itself, but rather in some other way. And finally, the last part of the translation. Actual knowledge is identical with its object. In the individual, potential knowledge is in time prior to actual knowledge. Let's pause there for a moment. In the individual human being, the potentiality for knowing is prior in time to the person actually knowing. All right, let's go on then. But let me get a running start here. Actual knowledge is identical with its object. So to know is to have an identity with a thing. In the individual, potential knowledge is in time prior to actual knowledge. But absolutely, it is not prior even in time. That's an interesting point then. Something of knowledge is there even before. The actuality of knowledge is there even before human knowing takes place. He goes on, it does not sometimes think and sometimes not think. The indication then seems to be that this is some other kind of thing, this actualizing aspect. We notice that we ourselves go from not knowing to knowing, so we have within us the potentiality to know, which then comes to be actualized. But as he indicates here, absolutely it is not even prior in time. So there must be something that does not sometimes think and sometimes not think. That is, it seems that there is something always actual in thinking involved in this process, and that what is actually involved in thinking somehow comes to provide actuality of knowing in us, where previously it was merely potential knowing. Now he goes on in the translation, when separated, it is alone just what it is, and this above is immortal and eternal. We do not remember while this is impassible. Passive thought is perishable. And without this, nothing thinks, period. Now that's all of De Anima 3.5. And it has many diverse interpretations. But in the latter part here, it seems that there is some entity of some kind or some power or something that is outside of the human being and separated. And when separated, it is just what it is. And it is immortal and eternal. But of course, ordinary human beings are not immortal and eternal for Aristotle. So it seems that there is something separate here. There's reason to believe, and certainly the tradition did, that for Aristotle, there is something called the active or agent aspect of intellect, or substance of intellect, that is separate from individual human beings in some way. But now I'm starting to give you an interpretation. And there are many contrary interpretations that I could present as well, so I'll stop here with the interpretation. So, let's go back and think more generally about Aristotle's psychology and Aristotle on the soul. How do we obtain sensible forms? Aristotle doesn't spell out the whole procedure, but he does talk about the actuality that is in the thing outside coming to be in the soul, and that we know the forms of things of the world through sensible forms. We know that in ourselves through sensible forms. Or rather than say no, I should say we sensibly apprehend the forms of things, and that's how we have sensible apprehension and a sensible experience of things of the world by means of their forms. But how do we obtain intelligible forms? The sensible forms immediately can act upon the senses. But do intelligible forms immediately act on the senses? The intelligible forms as actually intelligible are not present in the world. Rather, they're in particulars of the world as potentially intelligible, not actually. Do the actual intelligible forms then come from on high in some way into our minds, which are able to receive, that is, our minds that are potential and able to receive intelligible forms? Precisely what does Aristotle mean by this? Or does he mean perhaps that we might in some way form in ourselves, in our minds, by watching things outside of us, without any movement of things of the world into us? Certainly it's very hard to see how a sensible form could come into us and suddenly become actualized as intelligence, actualized as intellectual form, actualized as intelligible, because it's only sensible. As sensible, it's a particular. So something more has to go on here. De Anima 3.5 then indicates the need for two powers of intellect. Now, how are we to understand this? Again, there are many interpretations. There is, though I will note in just a couple of minutes, that there is a common interpretation to the later Greek and the Arabic tradition. Now, for Thomas Aquinas, however, he is the one who puts forward a radically different interpretation, different from the Greek and Arabic tradition, on Aristotle. And as we'll see, Aquinas owes more to his own religious and philosophical context than to the original Greek texts or the Arabic tradition on this. What do I mean? For Aquinas, the notion that the active or actual or agent aspect of intellect is a separate entity, something held by philosophers of the Greek and Arabic traditions, for Aquinas that is impossible. And instead, Aquinas asserts that the active aspect and the potential aspect are two powers in each individual soul. Now, that is not found clearly stated in the Greek text of Aristotle, nor in the Greek tradition, nor in the Arabic tradition. So Aquinas' view is one, in fact, that comes more out of his own religious and philosophical context. There is a concern, following Augustine, a concern that the human mind is individual to each human being. And so thinkers before Aquinas put together this notion that these, as we will see, that these are two powers of an individual's immaterial soul. But again, that owes more to his own religious and philosophical context than it does to the text of Aristotle, certainly, because this is such an interpretation is not found obvious in Aristotle. though some modern interpreters have tried to see it there and have argued this. I have in mind, in some sense, I think John Rist is somewhat moving toward this, but it's also in Lloyd Gerson, and then there are other very different interpretations, such as Victor Caston and Stephen Menn as well. They give a completely different approach to this, quite different from what the tradition had done, but very interesting and philosophically stimulating approaches. But let's move on. Now, we shouldn't forget, in spite of the fact that in the medieval period, Aristotelianism, in both the Arabic tradition and in the, especially in the Latin European tradition, Aristotelianism was quite dominant. Nevertheless, in the Greek context, what was dominant was Platonism. And that was based on the notion, again in Plato, simply that of the impossibility of knowledge through objects of the physical world. Somehow through recollection or some other way, or moving to a higher level in some way, then for the Platonists, that's how one obtains knowledge or actuality of intellectual understanding. This we find in Plotinus, who says that there is an ascent of the soul to the intelligible world for the sake of knowledge. And as you know, Plotinus also has a notion of mystical experience of the one as well, which, since the one is above being, such an experience with it is indescribable, because any description would have to use the language of what is, or being. So this is an affirmation made of the human rational soul by Plotinus, that it can rise up to that higher level, and to the intelligible world to have understanding, and then it can even rise higher or be raised higher by the one in a mystical experience. But in this context then, surely human rational knowledge and human science is affirmed only insofar as we reach above the world and leave sensation behind. Now, Plotinus, however, himself combated the views of Alexander of Aphrodisias, who preceded Plotinus and had a chair in Aristotelian studies. So Plotinus reasserts here very strongly in his thought the Platonic approach and the dominance of Platonism throughout the tradition. But Alexander of Aphrodisias was much more of an Aristotelian. And so let's have a look at Alexander. So Alexander flourished around 200, the year 200 of the Common Era, and as we've seen then, Plotinus was a later thinker and criticized Alexander in detail. Now, Alexander holds that this active aspect of intellect that Aristotle talks about in De Anima 3:5, let's call it the agent intellect. Alexander holds that agent intellect causes the actuality of intellectual understanding in humans. Well, that's much in accord. It seems to be much in accord with what Aristotle says in De Anima 3:5. But for Alexander, this agent intellect is the one ultimate God. So there is an identification of agent intellect and God in Alexander. And two of the people I just mentioned a few minutes ago, interpreters in Greek philosophy, interpreters of Plotinus, as John Rist and his once student, Lloyd Gerson, both explicitly hold that the Alexandrian approach in this, an identification of agent intellect and God, is in fact what Aristotle himself had meant. I don't see the necessity for that argument, although it's certainly possible. I still don't. I don't see good enough reasons to hold that argument. But that's another story. Now, on this account of Alexander, human beings are perishable. They come into existence and go out of existence. But they can have intellectual understanding of the essences or natures of things in the world. How so? Through abstraction of forms from sensory experience. Now, in the case of Aristotle, I did not mention the notion of abstraction with regard to sensation and intellection. Aristotle does not use that language. And that language of abstraction means in some way, then, in the particular thing in the world is the intelligible, which can be pulled off in some way and brought into the level of intellectual understanding. So to abstract is to separate. So somehow through the experience of particulars, We can separate their forms and they become immaterial and somehow become objects of intellectual understanding. This is very difficult to see how this could happen because the content that we look at consists of the sensibles, which are determinate particulars, not universals, as the intelligibles are. So in this context, then, what Alexander brings in is that that God or the agent intellect raises up in some way the intelligible that was in the experience to a different level. So a connection with God or agent intellect causes intelligibles to be present in human understanding by God providing the power for intellectual abstraction. Now, this requires a much greater explanation, and probably much greater explanation than what Alexander himself provides. But I would urge you to have a look at the De Intellectu of Alexander and Alexander's remarks on the De Anima as well for yourself to see his discussions of the notion of intellectual abstraction. But clearly he uses the language of abstraction. He is the first to use it in such a thoroughgoing way to describe how it is we go from not knowing to knowing. As you'll see in what follows, this notion of abstraction is, again, not present in Aristotle, but this notion of abstraction is used again and again after this to interpret the account of Aristotle in the De Anima. Although, I want to stress, it is not explicitly present in Aristotle himself, but is one of the interpretations that began with Alexander of Aphrodisias. And notice the dates. We're talking about hundreds of years after Aristotle before this interpretation of Aristotle came to the forefront and eventually became an interpretation common to the tradition, to the Greek tradition, well, to the Arabic tradition and to the Latin tradition as well. But let's proceed. Now, the classical rationalist tradition in philosophy in Islamic lands. Now, certainly I want to mention that the Islamic philosophy, it seems, grew out mostly from the Greek tradition in Alexandria. There certainly is a possibility of work coming from Athens as well. We know that Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the translator, says that he went into the lands of the Greeks and looked at manuscripts and learned Greek there, so some of it came from there as well. But a great deal of thought, we know, came from the late Greek tradition in Alexandria, including notions of God as a creator coming out of that with Ammonius. And that's something certainly quite worthy of study. I want to make just a few remarks, though, here to set the context with this key notion of intellectual understanding. I want to make a few remarks on three of the major thinkers from the classical rationalist tradition in philosophy in the Islamic lands. The first is AlFarabi, who lived a long life, as you can see, born in 870 and died in 950. He worked mostly at Baghdad, but he also worked at Damascus as well. Now, for AlFarabi, there is the notion of emanation of intelligibles from the agent intellect. This was not clearly stated by Aristotle, but here it is in AlFarabi, the notion that the intelligibles of things emanate from the agent intellect in a way. And that agent intellect is the last in a hierarchy of cosmic intellects. In this case, however, the emanations are for the guidance of humans through prophecy and rule by the lawgiver. So according to AlFarabi, in one of his accounts anyway, or a number of his accounts, then intelligibles come forth from the agent intellect into the mind of the prophet or the lawgiver, where they are translated into representations that can be understood by other human beings. Since not all human beings are able to be philosophers, either for want of learning, want of economic opportunity, or want of human ability or native intelligence. Not everyone is able to do that. And so according to AlFarabi, what the prophet and the lawgiver do is they provide then accounts that share the truth of the intelligibles by way of representations in scripture and in other representations in religion. This is particularly clear in AlFarabi's Kitab al-Millah, or Book of Religion, but it's also clear in the Perfect State and several other works of AlFarabi. We'll talk about some of these works of AlFarabi later on in the course. Now, for AlFarabi, though, abstraction of intelligibles from sensory experience is discussed in detail, in particular in his Risala fil Aql, or Treatise on the Intellect, and it's also in his Political Regime and other works as well. And there he says that abstraction of intelligibles from sensory experience takes place, and this is, remember, abstraction is a separation. And so somehow the intelligibles are separated off. But we've already seen the difficulty with that, because sensory experience always deals with particulars. So something needs to come in and intellectualize in some way the sensory experiences after we've had them, and raise them up from the level of particulars to the level of universals. And that's exactly what AlFarabi says happens with human knowing. Abstraction of intelligibles from sensory experience involves a transfer of intelligible content from the mode of being of sensed particulars to the mode of being of immaterial intelligibles. That is, there's a separation of these, but also a transfer to a higher level of being, the level of being of immaterial intelligibles, says AlFarabi. Now, AlFarabi says that in the case of human intellectual understanding, this takes place because of something that was given to human beings by the ancient intellect. And with this something, human beings are able to themselves do this transference. Now, what is this something? He does not name it in his Risala fil Aql or Treatise on the Intellect. Rather, but it seems to be, in fact, the ability to receive and separate, right? The ability to receive the intelligible content of particulars on the higher level of mode of being of immaterial intelligibles. And that's discussed, again, in his Risala fil Aql. He's quite clear about that. So abstraction involves a transference of intelligible content from a lower mode of being of sense particulars to a higher mode of being of immaterial intelligibles. What makes such a transfer possible? Well, according to this account in AlFarabi, a power given to the individual human soul makes the transfer possible. The power of receiving things as intelligibles. Now we'll see this is interpreted in quite a different way by some later thinkers, this general notion of the role of the ancient intellect. But let's proceed. And Avicenna, and certainly this is in brief. This is in a great deal of brevity here, so forgive me, but we just do not have time right now in this discussion of epistemology. If you'd like more information on Avicenna, I urge you to look at the videos from and the syllabus from the 2012 course that we had at the Universidad Panamericana, the Catholic University in Leuven, and Marquette University. That material is available, the entire course is available with all its videos to you on a website at the Marquette Library, and that link has been provided to you on the course website. So this is that is the course from 2012, fall 2012. So if you want more on Avicenna, take a look there. Now let's look at, very briefly though, here Avicenna, who died in 1037. And just again, just on this issue of intellectual understanding, human knowing. We'll look at Avicenna on metaphysics later on in this course, certainly. Now, sensation and the internal powers of soul, says Avicenna, and those internal powers are more clearly described here than they were in Aristotle. But for Avicenna, those internal powers are common sense, and the common sense unites the data from the 5 external senses into a single image. It involves imagination, which receives the image from common sense. Then it involves the processing of a faculty that he calls estimation or cogitation. In the case of human beings, it's called cogitation. And then also memory. But these are only preparatory stages. The experience of the world is only preparatory for intellectual understanding. In fact, as we'll see, for Avicenna, the content of intellectual understanding does not come from the world. The content of it, which is the content of the intelligible in act, or if you wish, the universal, that content comes from the ancient intellect, that separate intellect as a separate entity. So take special note here of the order and the activities of the internal senses, but keep in mind that these are only preparatory. So the content of intellectual knowledge does not come from the sensible world. To this extent, then, he's Platonist. Sensation is only the preparation for intellectual understanding. Well, sensation is required, though, by the human being who is a soul making use of a body as a tool. That's Avicenna's view, as we'll see later. So the content, intelligible in act, comes from not the world, but the agent intellect, the last in the hierarchy of emanated intellects, in a way described sometimes as emanation to the individual human being, to the mind of the individual human being, the intellect of the individual human being, and sometimes as a linking by the human mind or intellect to the agent intellect above it. So the two images are used. But either way, what's important is that the intelligibles themselves are only had through a linking to the agent intellect where the intelligibles themselves, intelligibles in act, primarily exist. Abstraction in this case, then, is not a transfer of content from sensory experience. Recall, that's what we had in AlFarabi in the previous slide. It is a transfer of content from sensory experience. Of course, the content has to be raised to a higher level of being, or mode of being, as I put it, according to AlFarabi. But nevertheless, it is a transfer, so it's a genuine abstraction where the objects of knowledge are in the world and then are transferred to a higher level where they are intellectual in the individual human soul. But that's not what Avicenna is saying. Avicenna is saying that there is not a transfer of content from sensory experience, but rather the content comes from the agent intellect where all those intelligibles primarily exist. Now Averroes, in brief again as well. Averroes died quite a bit later in 1198. Now he followed Avicenna in a number of important ways, but generally regarded Avicenna as a thinker who went too far into a form of Platonism of some kind. Avicenna affirmed Averroes affirmed a genuine abstraction of intelligibles from the content of sensory experience and apprehension, following AlFarabi in certain ways. And Averroes even talks about a kind of transfer from one level of being to another level of being, which surely indicates that he's looking directly at the Risala fil Aql, or Treatise on the Intellect of AlFarabi. So for Averroes, the content of human intellectual understanding comes from the world of sensory experience by a process of refinement through sensation, common sense, imagination, cogitation, and memory, all taking place before the act of intellectual abstraction. All those are required to prepare for the intellectual abstraction. Notice, for those of you who are familiar with Thomas Aquinas, the content of natural knowing comes from the world for Aquinas, and in that Aquinas is following exactly what Averroes says. The content is to be found in the world of sensory experience. Of course, on the basis of that, we can argue to higher things, but we're talking about the formation of knowledge through abstraction here. And this doctrine of abstraction, which we'll finish up in just a moment, this doctrine of abstraction in Averroes is the basis for the doctrine of abstraction put forward by Aquinas. So continue with Averroes for one more slide. The powers of abstraction and the reception of the abstracted or separated intelligible for Averroes cannot be in particular human beings. Why? Because intelligibles cannot exist in individuals without becoming individualized by the subject into which it's received. So it would be particularized if it's received into a particular. And thereby it would no longer be an immaterial intelligible. It would be a particularized intelligible, but not an immaterial intelligible. This is a notion that Averroes took from his reading of the late peripatetic commentator Themistius. And again, if you want more information on that, take a look at the discussions of this in the 2012, fall 2012 course on Aquinas' Soul and Intellect, where this is discussed in detail with video lectures as well. So according to Averroes, intellect is another kind of soul. Recall, Aristotle raised the question of whether intellect was another kind of soul, and Averroes says, yes, it is. It's another kind of soul. It's not the soul that is the actualization of body. Indeed, according to Averroes, it's called soul only by a complete equivocation. It doesn't have the same meaning as the life principle in a body at all. It's a complete equivocation, since it is altogether different from soul. Intellect and soul are completely different because soul is the actualization of a body, whereas intellect necessarily does not involve body. Hence, according to Averroes, human beings are perishable entities who can have intellectual understanding only by linking to separately existing agent intellect and the separate material or possible intellect. Because the intellect in understanding universals can't as such be present in individuals, reasons Averroes. So humans link with and share the powers of those intellects in varying degrees, but this is how human individuals can have intellectual understanding for parts of their lives, and their lives are, again, only in this world. So Averroes thinks it's necessary that these two things be actual intellects existing separate from human beings. And the reason for that is that the abstracting power must be an immaterial power. It certainly can't be a bodily power. What separates and intelligizes these particulars presented to the intellect by the other powers we mentioned, then what separates those has to itself be an intellect if it's going to intellectualize something. And similarly, if we are going to receive intelligibles in some way, intelligibles as such cannot be received into bodies. They cannot be received into the human brain, because the human brain is a particular bodily organ. So there must be something separate into which they are received, and that separate thing is the material or possible intellect. So humans link with these and share the powers of these intellects in varying degrees. Now, as we'll see in the next videos, especially the video discussing the account of Albert the Great, Aquinas' teacher, who provided Aquinas with the foundational epistemology that Aquinas accepts in his early works and continues to develop in later works, we'll see that what's key to Averroes here is that he is saying that there is some way in which these separate intellects come to be in the soul, or they come to be formed for us. So somehow, even though human beings are perishable particulars, for some period, human beings are able to connect and have intellectual understanding through that connection with the separate agent intellect and the separate material intellect. Now, a few remarks on translations here, because it gives us more of the sense of the sources and contextualizes the sources available to Aquinas. The Avicenna's De Anima, which is the most important work with regard to this notion of intellectual understanding, the De Anima was translated in the 12th century Toledo by Domingo Gundesalvi, who died in 1181. Now, this work of Avicenna is not a summary, paraphrase, or commentary, but it's an original work with novel analyses of the nature of soul and intellect. And as I already indicated, for Avicenna, the soul is per se rational and uses the body as a tool for gaining more knowledge. The soul gains more knowledge, or the rational soul gains more knowledge by experiencing the particulars of the world, which prepares it for the connection or receiving the emanation from the agent intellect. It's a very different account. Obviously, there are Platonic elements to it. It may be influenced as well by the theology of Aristotle, a work that we'll talk about later. But certainly it's a foundational work, and this was the major philosophical account that the Latin Europeans had available to them. A very sophisticated and well-argued account in Avicenna's De Anima. And also, Domingo Gundesalvi has his own De Anima and has written his own works on Avicenna as well. Those works involve a mixture of the ideas of St. Augustine and others, in which Domingo Gundesalvi was certainly raised, and the thought of Avicenna. Now, the Averroes' long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle was translated around 1220 by Michael Scott at the court of Emperor Frederick II. This is a commentary, that is a paragraph by paragraph intensive commentary drawing on the Greek and Arabic philosophical traditions on the soul. It is detailed. In the Latin, I think it's 546 pages, rather full pages, in the Latin edition. And you have now available my translation of this text into English as well, with notes and an extensive introduction, which you may want to have a look at. But the point is that Averroes taught the Latins how to read with care the De Anima of Aristotle. And contained within Averroes' long commentary is the very text of the De Anima of Aristotle. He will give the paragraph and then explicate it in detail, and he'll also cite other thinkers of the Greek and Arabic philosophical traditions. So it's quite sophisticated and was an important value to the Latin Europeans as they learned to read Aristotle. Whereas Avicenna touched on the same topics in Aristotle, but did not give a summary, paraphrase, or commentary, but rather developed his own philosophical analyses. I want to close with a remark about Ibn Daud or Ibn Daud and the Latin translations. And the remark is this: someone had to tell the Latins what texts they should translate. Someone had to know the Arabic tradition in order to guide the Latins as to what should be rendered into Latin. And it seems, on the basis of some of the work of Alexander Fedora, who works in Barcelona, done some very important work. It seems on the basis of the works of Alexander Fedora that it's likely that Ibn Daud was in fact this person. That is, Ibn Daud played an extraordinarily important role early on in helping the Latins understand what was available for them in the philosophical tradition coming from Arabic, and what texts should be translated. Someone had to guide them, and it appears then that Ibn Daud did this. Of course, the Ibn Daud, the name is a Jewish name, and so Ibn Daud, as the Jew, likely knew Latin and also knew Arabic as well. And so he seems to have played a very important role in helping the Latins select what material should be translated. Finally, where does one find a more detailed account? Well, as I've said, the account here is brief with the purpose of conveying some key aspects found in sources employed by Aquinas. And this is our account of Aquinas' natural philosophy, or the sources for it. A deeper version of this, an account of this, is to be found in the 2012 course, as I've mentioned a couple of times already. And that complete course can be found by searching for Thomas Aquinas, Soul and Intellect at epublications.marquette.edu. Or you may go directly to this other link as well. I'd suggest you search epublications.marquette.edu and search for Thomas Aquinas, Soul and Intellect if you'd like more detailed accounts. So that will suffice for this lecture, and I'll call it to a close. Thank you for your attention.